From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Many of you used to ask me over the months and the weeks, when are you going to join the ICC? And I was telling you soon, and very soon, and very soon, and it has happened.
The Palestinian Authority has chosen to launch a confrontation with the State of Israel, and we are not sitting idly by. We will not allow the dragging of IDF soldiers and the IDF commanders to the International Criminal Court at The Hague.
In a move opposed by the United States and Israel, Palestinian authorities have submitted a request to join the International Criminal Court just days after the UN Security Council rejected a Palestinian resolution to end the Israeli occupation. We'll speak with Ali Abunimah of Electronic Intifada and Phyllis Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies. Then to the Lords of Secrecy.
Over the last 12 years, we've seen a shift away from democratic participation in decisions about war and peace. The people know much less about what's happening. Congress is much less involved. Increasingly, all these vital decisions are taken secretly by national security elites, and the tool that's been used to accomplish all of that is secrecy. Because what the people don't know, they can't have any meaningful say in.
As the first U.S. drone strike of 2015 kills 9 in Pakistan, we'll speak to human rights attorney Scott Horton about the national security elite and America's stealth warfare. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Thousands gathered in New York City on Sunday for the funeral of Wen Jianluo, one of the 2 police officers killed in a targeted ambush last month. Lu's widow, Pei Xiachen, paid tribute to her husband.
The caring son, a loving husband, and a loyal friend. You are an amazing man. Even though he left us early, but I believe that he is still with us. His spirit will continue to look after us. He will keep an eye over our soldiers to protect us. Ranger is my hero.
New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio also spoke, saying the whole city is heartbroken over the police officers' killings.
All of our city is heartbroken today. And we've seen it over these last 2 weeks. We've seen the pain that people feel from all walks of life, the sense of appreciation for the sacrifices of this family and of the Ramos family, their understanding for people who have never worn a uniform of how many dangers our men and women in uniform face and what it means for their families. All of this city is feeling the pain right now, and all of this city wants to lift up the Liu family and the Ramos family.
As Mayor de Blasio spoke, scores of police officers outside the service again turned their backs on him, as they had previously at the funeral of police officer Rafael Ramos and at the hospital where the 2 officers were taken after the shooting. The officers' collective snub came despite orders from Police Commissioner Bill Bratton that they not turn their backs. It was the latest in the NYPD's protests against de Blasio over his comments on police brutality and racial profiling. Late last month, officers launched a virtual work stoppage, reducing or halting summonses, tickets, and arrests. As NYPD officers continue their protests of the mayor, actions against police brutality and racial profiling continue nationwide. In New York City, a group of demonstrators staged a die-in Friday outside the Manhattan studios of Fox News.
We're protesting specifically the treatment of the cases of police brutality in New York and around the country by right-wing media organizations, but that extends to all major corporate media networks, which operate on a system of profit, not on issues of justice.
You know, we want accountability. We want fair news, which Fox does not provide at all. With the most recent incident being that they used audio sound bites over our protesting to say that we were saying horrible things about NYPD, and that is not what we're out here for. We're not against all police. We just want accountability for the bad ones.
In Ohio, the death of a mentally ill African-American woman in police custody has been ruled a homicide. Tanisha Anderson's family had called the police for help as she suffered from a mental health episode in November. A coroner found Tanisha Anderson died, quote, as a result of being physically restrained in a prone position by Cleveland police. Anderson suffered from heart disease, which was also listed as a factor in her death. Her family wants an independent prosecutor to investigate. Israel's halted the transfer of tax revenues to the Palestinian Authority in retaliation for its bid to join the International Criminal Court. On Friday, Palestinian officials submitted documents to join the ICC in a move opposed by both Israel and the United States. Palestinian UN Ambassador Riyad Mansour said the PA will seek the prosecution of Israeli officials for war crimes in the occupied territories.
It is a peaceful option. It is a civilized option. It is an option that anyone who upholds the law should not be afraid of. And it is an option that we are seeking in order to seek justice for all the victims that have been killed by Israel, the occupying power. The last group of them, the more than 500 children in Gaza last summer, more than 3,000 children injured, and 1,000 more of civilians killed and injured.
In response, the Israeli government's holding up tens of millions of dollars it's collected on the Palestinian Authority's behalf as the occupier of the Palestinian territories. The money's needed to pay salaries and provide public services. The Palestinian Authority opted to join the ICC after the U.S. and Israel successfully lobbied against a UN Security Council measure calling for an end to the Israeli occupation and the establishment of a Palestinian state by 2017. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas says he's discussing plans to resubmit the statehood resolution despite the threat of a U.S. veto. We'll have more on this story after headlines. An Egyptian court has ordered a retrial of 3 Al Jazeera journalists jailed for over a year now. Peter Greste, Mohammed Fahmy, and Bahar Mohammed were convicted on terrorism charges, including spreading false news in support of the Muslim Brotherhood, deemed by the Egyptian government a terrorist group. On Thursday, Egypt's Court of Cassation overruled the original conviction, citing procedural flaws. But the 3 will remain behind bars until their case is reheard. After the ruling, family members of Greste and Fahmy called on the Egyptian government to release and deport them to their home countries.
Now that Peter is essentially an innocent man, he's not a convict anymore. It does allow for some room to move and for steps to be taken for him to step in and enact his presidential powers and deport them.
I can't even imagine that he will stay for a year in prison. His lawyer Amal Clooney just applied to the Egyptian presidency and the Egyptian prosecutor for Mohammed to be deported to Canada and be treated as a Canadian citizen, and to continue the trial there. I'm still waiting for a miracle to happen.
A U.S. drone strike in Pakistan has reportedly killed 9 people. The victims were described as foreign militants in North Waziristan. Around 24 civilians were killed in Afghanistan last week after shelling struck a wedding party in Helmand province. The deaths came amidst reported fighting between Afghan forces and Taliban militants, just days after the Afghan military took over formal security control from the U.S.-led NATO occupation force. The Afghan military says it's investigating. The U.S. has expanded sanctions against North Korea following the recent hack of the media giant Sony Pictures. On Friday, President Obama signed an executive order targeting North Korean entities and individuals in what the White House called a first step in its retaliation. North Korea has denied responsibility for the hack, which released tens of thousands of Sony emails and files. The new sanctions come as private experts are raising doubts about North Korea's responsibility. The security firm Norse says the attack could have been the work of a former Sony employee working with pro-piracy hacktivists. Norse reportedly briefed the FBI last week, but the FBI says it stands by its assessment North Korea was behind the attack. The FBI has reportedly begun helping Mexican authorities with an investigation into the disappearance of 43 students in the southern state of Guerrero. So far, the remains of only one student have been identified after authorities say police turned the students over to members of a local gang who killed them and burned their bodies. NBC News reports U.S. scientists are helping to analyze forensic evidence. Meanwhile, Mexican authorities have arrested 10 more local police officers, bringing the total number of people arrested to about 90, most of them police. Last week, parents and colleagues of the missing students were honored in Mexico's southernmost state of Chiapas by Zapatistas, who are marking the 21st anniversary of their uprising against the Mexican government. A Libyan al-Qaeda suspect snatched from the streets of Tripoli by U.S. forces has died in New York just over a week before he was due to stand trial. Abu Anas al-Libi was accused of helping plan the 1998 bombings of U.S. embassies in Africa. He was captured in Tripoli in 2013 and interrogated on a naval ship at sea before being brought to New York, where he was due to face trial next week. He died on Friday of complications from liver surgery. Libby was ill with hepatitis C at the time of his capture. His arrest sparked protests in Libya and pressure on the beleaguered Libyan government. Jury selection begins today in the trial of Boston Marathon bombing suspect Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. 3 people were killed and 264 wounded when a pair of homemade bombs exploded near the race's finish line. Tsarnaev faces 30 federal counts, including the bombing of a public place, malicious destruction of public property, and use of a weapon of mass destruction resulting in death. He's accused of plotting the attacks with his older brother, Tamerlan, who died in a firefight with police. Federal prosecutors are seeking the death penalty, a rarity for a federal case. Thousands of undocumented immigrants lined up across California Friday to obtain driver's licenses for the first time. A law approved in late 2013 makes California the most populous state to provide driver's licenses to undocumented immigrants. The measure drew wide support from police officials and insurance companies, as well as immigrants' rights groups. A DMV spokesperson welcomed the law's implementation.
This is a very, very important day for DMV and for California in general, because this is the first day that people who are undocumented residents of California are able to obtain their license in a legal manner, and because the implementation of AB 60, the law that allows them to obtain a license.
A judge in New York is expected to decide today whether to release documents considered by the Staten Island grand jury that chose not to indict NYPD officer Daniel Pantaleo for the chokehold death of unarmed African-American Eric Garner. Garner's family has sued to have witness testimony, the full medical examiner's report, and other records released. Garner died after Pantaleo wrestled him to the ground and officers piled on top of him while he repeatedly said, "I can't breathe." The prosecutor who failed to secure a grand jury indictment in the case, Daniel Donovan, has said he's considering running for the House seat to be vacated by Congressmember Michael Grimm. And former New York Governor Mario Cuomo has died at the age of 82. Cuomo served 3 terms as Democratic governor between 1983 and 1995. He died just hours after his son, current New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, was sworn in for a second term. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In a move opposed by the United States and Israel, Palestinian authorities have submitted a request to join the International Criminal Court and sign over a dozen other international treaties. Riyad Mansour, the chief Palestinian observer at the United Nations, submitted the diplomatic documents on Friday, saying the Palestinian Authority will seek the prosecution of Israeli officials for war crimes in the occupied territories.
It is a peaceful option. It is a civilized option. It is an option that anyone who upholds the law should not be afraid of. And it is an option that we are seeking in order to seek justice for all the victims that have been killed by Israel, the occupying power. The last group of them, the more than 500 children in Gaza last summer, more than 3,000 children injured. and 1,000 more of civilians killed and injured.
One day after the Palestinians moved to join the International Criminal Court, Israel announced it would withhold at least $127 million in tax revenue owed to the Palestinian Authority. The money's needed to pay salaries and provide public services. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu accused the Palestinian Authority of launching a confrontation with Israel.
The Palestinian Authority has chosen to launch a confrontation with the State of Israel, and we are not sitting idly by. We will not allow the dragging of IDF soldiers and the IDF commanders to the International Criminal Court at The Hague. The ones who should face justice are the heads of the Palestinian Authority, who entered an alliance with the Hamas war criminals. IDF soldiers will continue to defend the State of Israel with determination and might, just as they defended us, and we will defend them with the same determination and the same might.
In Washington, D.C., a State Department spokesperson described the Palestinian move to join the ICC as, quote, entirely counterproductive, saying it, quote, badly damages the atmosphere with the very people with whom they ultimately need to make peace. In the West Bank city of Ramallah, PLO official Wassel Abu Youssef said Palestinians would not relinquish their claims under Israeli or U.S. pressure.
The Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian people will not give up on our Palestinian core issues: the right to be free and independent, the right to return, as well as a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital. The American administration is also competing with the occupying government by saying it will not send us aid money. This will not break the determination of the Palestinian leadership and people until we obtain freedom and the independence of Palestine.
The Palestinian move to join the International Criminal Court came just days after the UN Security Council rejected a resolution demanding an end to the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories within 3 years. Of the 15 members of the UN Security Council, only the United States and Australia voted against the measure. But it needed 9 votes to pass and only received 8 after Nigeria decided at the last minute to abstain from voting. The Guardian reports both U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called Nigeria's President Goodluck Jonathan to ask him to oppose the measure. The United States was expected to veto the measure if it passed. To talk more about the latest developments, we're joined by 2 guests. In Washington, D.C., Phyllis Bennis is with us, fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. She's written a number of books, including Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, as well as Calling the Shots, How Washington Dominates Today's United Nations. And joining us from Chicago via Democracy Now! Video stream, Ali Abunimah is with us, co-founder of the Electronic Intifada, author of the recent book, The Battle for Justice in Palestine. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Ali Abunimah, let's start with you on the significance of these developments at the United Nations. Begin with the UN Security Council vote ultimately did not support the Israeli withdrawal from the Palestine territories.
Good morning, Amy. Like many people, I was very relieved that the resolution failed. That might surprise some of your viewers, but the devil is in the detail. This was a very bad resolution written by the Palestinian Authority without any support from any other Palestinian factions. It's been condemned by Palestinian political figures and legal experts because in an attempt to avoid the American veto, it undercut and undermined and watered down very fundamental Palestinian rights. And if this resolution had passed, it would have superseded existing resolutions, which are far stronger. I'll give you just one example. In your headlines, you said this resolution calls for an end to the Israeli occupation. That's the headline, but in the small print, it does no such thing. It calls for a withdrawal of Israeli security forces, their replacement with a third-party presence, understood to mean American troops or NATO troops, and it allows for the Israeli settlements to remain behind. So it doesn't even call for settlements to be dismantled and withdrawn. That's why this resolution should not have passed and didn't. On the other hand, of course, the reason the U.S. Opposed it was not out of any concern for Palestinian rights, but out of the Obama administration's commitment unfailing commitment to do everything possible to thwart the Palestinians, no matter how they pursue their struggle, whether through the UN or whether through exercising their legitimate right to self-defense and resistance. This is an American administration that exceeds all of its predecessors in its tenacity and zeal in opposing the Palestinians and helping Israel to occupy, dispossess, and kill them.
Speaking last week, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Samantha Power explained why the U.S. objected to the UN resolution on Palestine.
Today's staged confrontation in the UN Security Council will not bring the parties closer to achieving a two-state solution. We voted against this resolution not because we are indifferent to the daily hardships or the security threats endured by Palestinians and Israelis, but because we know that those hardships will not cease and those threats will not subside until the parties reach a comprehensive settlement achieved through negotiations.
Phyllis Bennis, your response to what has taken place and its significance at the United Nations Security Council.
Thanks, Amy. I think that Ali Abunimah is absolutely right that this resolution would not have ended the occupation. It was also never going to pass, whether it was officially with a U.S. veto, if there had been 9 votes, or a U.S. no vote as a result of U.S. pressure to make sure there were not 9 votes. The U.S. was not going to let this pass. I think what's far more significant is the decision of the Palestinians, finally, after a great deal of pressure on the leader of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, to sign the documents to join the International Criminal Court. That ultimately has far more consequence than does these kinds of resolutions in the Security Council. The possibility of the International Criminal Court, which is a weak agency right now, it's a thoroughly politicized agency, but it's moving forward in the world, and I think over time we will see the court playing a greater role in international diplomacy as well as in international jurisdiction over war crimes. The possibility that Israeli officials, and it isn't only military officials, as Prime Minister Netanyahu indicated, it could also be, and would certainly also be, political officials as well as military, because things like settlements are war crimes as well as the direct war crimes committed in Gaza. People like the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister are in the chain of command, so they would also be liable for being brought up on charges. Now, they may say, well, that'll never happen. Fine, let Israel join the International Criminal Court. Israel is, of course, one of the outliers, along with the United States and a few others, very few other countries that have refused to sign and ratify the court, to join the court, to place its own officials under the court's jurisdiction. If Israel is so convinced that they wouldn't have anything to fear, let them join and find out. But the fact that the Palestinians are joining an international institution is important both for the substance and because this UN initiative overall, including, frankly, the Security Council resolution as far as it went, are major attacks on the legitimacy of the so-called diplomacy under U.S. control that has failed for the last 24 years. That's, I think, very important. It's put a number of European countries in the position of saying, we're no longer going to accept the idea that Washington gets to call the shots in the United Nations on the question of Palestine, that we are no longer going to be able to play an international role, that only the U.S. can determine what is a legitimate or illegitimate move by the Palestinians to obtain freedom and independence and an end to occupation and apartheid. In that context, I think the importance is far more on the level of the willingness of some European countries, France comes to mind, to stand up to U.S. pressure, to say, you know what, the kind of diplomacy that the U.S. has controlled for so many years has failed. We need a different kind of diplomacy that starts with international law.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion and also talk about the role of Nigeria on the UN Security Council. Phyllis Bennis, fellow at Institute for Policy Studies, and Ali Abunimah of the Electronic Intifada. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute. Palestinian heritage, Nasir Shama, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We're going to turn right now to the Fatah response to the vote at the UN Security Council. Last week, Palestinian officials criticized the rejection by the UN Security Council of a Palestinian resolution calling for the establishment of a Palestinian state. This is Fatah spokesman Ahmed Assaf.
Unfortunately, the Security Council failed in approving the draft resolution calling for the end of the Israeli occupation under a time frame. It happened because the Security Council failed in protecting its goals on which it was founded and its principles, which it usually propagates. It happened because there is a great power in this world set to protect and support the Israeli occupation, which represents the highest level of terrorism.
That was Fatah spokesperson Ahmed Assaf. Our guests are Phyllis Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies and Ali Abu-Nima of the Electronic Intifada. Phyllis, what about Nigeria and how this went down, Jordan's role as well as Africa?
Well, what we saw, Amy, on the Security Council was that Jordan, as usual, there was only one Arab country on the Council. Jordan played the role of bringing to the Council the Palestinian draft resolution to try and get a vote. There were a lot of questions, frankly, about why the vote was pushed last week rather than now, because with the new year, there are two new members on the Council, Malaysia and Venezuela, who are replacing South Korea and Argentina, making the Security Council significantly more willing to move in a direction pushed by the Palestinians. But the
didn't Jordan want to wait, but the Palestinian Authority wanted to push it forward?
There are reports of that. I don't have the inside story on it. I think it's important not to focus too much on the inside horse trading issues that go on at all times. What was consistent here was the idea that the U.S. is in a position to pressure other countries, particularly relatively weak and impoverished countries that depend on the U.S. Nigeria is not necessarily impoverished because of its oil, but its people are certainly impoverished because of legacies of colonialism and war over oil in that country. And one of the things that happened here was we saw the tradition of U.S. pressure on, in this case, another African country. It was Nigeria. The president of Nigeria, Goodluck Jonathan, was called not only by the Israeli leader, from whom Nigeria is buying a significant amount of arms, and presumably that arms deal was very much on the agenda of the call from Netanyahu to Goodluck Jonathan. He also was called, though, by Secretary of State Kerry, and there are reports that President Obama himself called Goodluck Jonathan the night before the vote. Now, that would be consistent with a longstanding U.S. habit, shall we say, of pressuring other countries at the UN. There's a longstanding precedent known as the Yemen precedent that stems back to the first Gulf War in 1990, when Yemen was one of only two countries, the other being Cuba, who voted against endorsing the U.S. attack and invasion of Iraq in what turned out to be 1991. And at that time, as soon as the Yemeni ambassador put down his hand after the vote, the U.S. ambassador was at his side saying, that will be the most expensive no vote you ever cast. And 3 days later, the U.S. cut its entire aid budget to Yemen. That remark was picked up on a UN microphone and broadcast around the world. Since that time, it's been known as the Yemen precedent, and the U.S. has used it over and over again to pressure, threaten, and in many cases bribe other countries to do what the U.S. wants. And that's happened more on the question of Palestine and Israel than any other question at the United Nations.
And to be clear, they didn't vote against it like U.S. and Australia, but they abstained, which meant
they abstained, which that was the loss from the 9 votes required to 8 votes, which meant that the U.S. no vote didn't officially count as a veto, although the difference between a no vote and a veto vote, when the U.S. is still responsible for the failure of the resolution, doesn't really mean very much.
Ali Abu-Nima, the response in the occupied territories, what this means, both the UN Security Council vote and the ICC, and the attempt to join the ICC.
Well, I can give you my response. I can't speak for other people, but as I mentioned, there was a broad consensus in Palestinian opinion against the content of the UN resolution, which Abbas submitted without Palestinian consensus behind him and which undermined fundamental Palestinian rights. As for the ICC, justice for the victims of the Israeli-American massacre in Gaza, the Israeli-American settlements in the occupied West Bank and in Jerusalem, and all the aspects of the Israeli-American colonial project in Palestine. Palestinians deserve justice for that. They deserve to bring the perpetrators of these crimes to justice. But the membership of the ICC must not be used as a political bargaining chip the way the illegitimate, unelected Palestinian Authority has used it. One day we're going to sign, the next day we're not going to sign. Of course, I don't trust this Palestinian Authority leadership, and if they get some insignificant promise from the United States, they may well freeze their membership or withdraw their signature or carry out some other maneuver. The other thing, I would like to respond to something Phyllis said earlier regarding the role of France versus the United States. I think it's a mistake to cast France as the role of hero in this story against the villainous United States at the UN. Remember, the content of this resolution, which was backed by France, is about guaranteeing Israel's long-term future as a racist Jewish state in Palestine. The difference between the United States and Israel is not that France supports Palestinian rights and the US opposes them. They only differ on how to secure Israel's long-term future as an apartheid state. The Obama administration, in practice, supports Netanyahu's vision of Greater Israel, where Israel annexes the occupied territories, because that's what Obama supports in practice. He's doing nothing to prevent that. France believes that Israel should continue to be a racist apartheid state, but only within the 1948 borders, and Palestinians should get a miniature Bantustan shorn of sovereignty, shorn of real independence, in order to allow Israel to continue to claim that it's a Jewish majority democracy. That's the difference between France and the United States. France is not a friend of the Palestinians. It did not support this resolution out of a concern for Palestinian rights. I think what people should take away from this soap opera at the United Nations is that Palestinians are not going to get justice from Obama. They're not going to get justice from Hillary Clinton or Elizabeth Warren or whoever next might be coming down the line. They're not going to get it from the UN, and they're not going to get it from the European Union, which continues to arm Israel to commit massacres against Palestinians. They are going to get it from resistance, legitimate resistance, which includes a global solidarity movement, a critical global solidarity movement whose major and most effective expression at this moment in history is boycott, divestment, and sanctions. One thing people should take away from this is that the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement has never been more necessary, never been more legitimate, and never been more urgent to put an end to this regime of apartheid and terror, which the United States and its allies continue to support in Palestine against millions of Palestinian people.
On Friday, the United States criticized Palestinian leaders for seeking to join the International Criminal Court. In a statement, State Department spokesperson Jeff Rathke said, quote, "Today's actions entirely counterproductive, does nothing to further the aspirations of the Palestinian people for a sovereign and independent state. It badly damages the atmosphere with the very people with whom they ultimately need to make peace." Phyllis Bennis, your response to that, as well as to what Ali has just laid out.
You know, I think Ali is absolutely right that the critical factor right now is the BDS movement globally. I think that the fact of the strength, the rising strength of the BDS movement, particularly in Europe, is very much the reason for the French decision here. It's absolutely true that France is not a great friend of the Palestinian people, and they are certainly no heroes. I never said or thought that. But I think that what is true is that the divide, the growing divide between governments, long-standing allies of the U.S., and their willingness to break with the U.S. on these critical questions is very much a reflection of the rising strength of BDS movements in countries around the world, whether it be South Africa, whether it be throughout Europe or elsewhere. So I think that those two things are very much linked. I think the question of the International Criminal Court is fundamental because of the question of international justice. The idea that somehow peace or justice in any form is going to come as a result of pretending that the Palestinians and Israelis come to the table as equals, as if this was Peru and Ecuador, for instance, sitting at a table to resolve a border dispute. That's not what's going on here. What we have is, on the one hand, the 23rd wealthiest country in the world, the only nuclear-armed country in the Middle East, the fourth most powerful military, by far the strongest military in the region, backed by the world's sole superpower on one hand, and on the other side of the table, a stateless population that is militarily occupied by another government without a state, without a military, without an economy to call its own, without control of its own airspace, its own waters, its own borders, etc. You can't call those two equal partners for peace because you sit them at the same table. That kind of negotiation is never going to work. And I think the significance of this new move is to say to the world, that's over. This kind of forced negotiation on a false premise is over because it has failed for 24 years. And that what we're now looking to is an international movement centered by the social movements of people, like the BDS movement at its core, and that governments will, over time, change in response to the pressure from their own populations. Eventually, when enough governments change, the United Nations will change. We saw that for a brief moment of 8 months in the run-up to the war in Iraq, where the UN and some governments, for their own opportunist reasons, stood on the side of preventing war, as the Charter commands them to do. We may see that over time on the question of Palestine. Right now, the critical factor is what former UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Richard Falk, has called the struggle for legitimacy. Israel is losing the struggle for legitimacy. It's losing that battle in the global arena. It's losing it critically here in the United States. And it's in the context of Israel's dwindling legitimacy that these moves in the United Nations, whether the Security Council or the International Criminal Court, take place. It's the loss of legitimacy that is now fundamental to Israel's position.
Ali Abunimah, the U.S. media's coverage of this, do you think it reflects the differences within Palestine, the differences of opinion?
No, of course it doesn't. You know, the routine mistake that's made is to equate the unelected, Israeli-backed, U.S.-financed Palestinian Authority with the Palestinians. And that's a big mistake because the Palestinian Authority acts despite the Palestinians. This is a Palestinian Authority engaged in a massive political crackdown against its opponents at home. This is a Palestinian Authority that is directly complicit in the ongoing siege of Gaza. We haven't seen Mahmoud Abbas and his cohort put a fraction of the effort into ending the siege of Gaza that continues to kill people there. Children dying in house fires because there's only electricity three hours a day now in Gaza, in many parts of Gaza. Instead, they put all their effort into this mirage of a UN resolution that only showed their weakness domestically and internationally. And what Palestinians are saying is that, you know, after all these years of struggle and suffering, they're not prepared to give up their most basic rights for nothing more than a Bantustan, which isn't even on offer. And Amy, if I may, I want to respond to the clip of the U.S. official, I didn't catch his name, that you played.
Jeff Rafty, State Department.
Yes, Jeff Rafty of the State Department, about how joining the ICC doesn't help the atmosphere. I'll tell you what didn't help the atmosphere was when, during the summer massacre in Gaza, when dozens of people were being killed every day by Israeli bombs, when entire neighborhoods were being destroyed and carpet bombed by Israeli shelling, when during that time the Obama administration, President Obama, decided to resupply the Israeli military with bombs so it could continue to murder people in Gaza. To put it mildly, that didn't help the atmosphere. Palestinians do not want to hear lectures from the American administration that helped and continues to help to murder them and steal their land. The U.S. administration of Barack Obama has nothing to say that Palestinians need to listen to.
Ali Abunimah, I want to thank you for being with us, co-founder of the Electronic Intifada, author of the recent book, The Battle for Justice in Palestine, speaking to us from Chicago, and Phyllis Bennis, fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. Among her books, Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict and Calling the Shots, How Washington Dominates Today's United Nations. She's speaking to us from Washington, D.C. When we come back, we'll be joined by attorney Scott Horton. His book, Lords of Secrecy, the National Security Elite and America's Stealth Foreign Policy. Stay with us.
Got a secret, can you keep it? Swear this one you'll save. Better lock it in your pocket, taking this one to the grave. If I show you, then I know you won't tell what I said. 'Cause two can keep a secret if one of them is dead. Why do you smile like you've been told a secret? Now you're telling lies 'cause you have sworn to keep it. But no one keeps a secret. No one keeps a secret. Why, when we do our darkest deeds, do we tell? They burn and our brains become a living hell. 'Cause everybody tells, everybody tells. Got a secret, can you keep it? Swear this one you'll save. Better lock it in your pocket, taking this one to the grave. If I show you, then I know you won't tell what I said. 'Cause two can keep a secret if one of them is dead.
Secret, the Pierces. Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report, I'm Amy Goodman. At least 9 Pakistanis were killed Sunday in a U.S. drone strike in North Waziristan. It was the first reported U.S. drone strike of 2015. News accounts of the strike are based on unnamed Pakistani government and security officials. The Obama administration said nothing so far. For years, the United States did not even publicly acknowledge the existence of the drone strikes. The drone program's just one example of the national security state's reliance on secret operations. The recent Senate Intelligence Committee report revealed another example, the shadowy network of overseas CIA black sites where the U.S. held and tortured prisoners. The report also noted the CIA shrouded itself in a cloak of secrecy, keeping policymakers largely in the dark about the brutality of its prisoner interrogations. The agency reportedly deceived the White House, the National Security Council, the Justice Department, and Congress about the efficacy of its controversial interrogation techniques. Our next guest has closely followed the debate over national security and secrecy. Scott Horton's human rights attorney, contributing editor at Harper's Magazine, lecturer at Columbia Law School. He's out this week with a new book. It's called Lords of Secrecy, the National Security Elite and America's Stealth Foreign Policy. Scott Horton, welcome to Democracy Now!
Great to be with you, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. Who are the Lords of Secrecy?
The Lords of Secrecy are the leaders of the nation's national security and intelligence institutions. They're the people who have the power to create secrets under American law, and they use this power to enhance their own position in Washington and to seize the ability to make critical decisions about national security matters that used to be made as part of our democratic process.
Mike Gravel, the former Alaska senator who read the Pentagon, or put the Pentagon Papers into the record, making them public, called on Mark Udall, the outgoing Colorado senator, though it could be any senator, for example, like Senator Wyden of Oregon, who's also been expressed deep concern about the torture report and intelligence, to make the whole report public. Your thoughts on this?
I think that's an important next step. I would say the entire report needs to be public, although I think even those advocating that would agree that there would probably be some redactions of names of individual personnel, for instance, names of countries and of some sites. But I would go beyond that, and I'd say also the Panetta report needs to be made public. That is the independent document that was prepared inside the CIA as the Senate Intelligence Committee was preparing its study, which reaches on the basis of the same materials exactly the same conclusions and shows that even the CIA does not believe what is being claimed in its name by Director Panetta, as well as by the former directors, Tenet and Hayden.
Last month, the outgoing Democratic Senator Udall called for a purge of top CIA officials implicated in the abuses and the ensuing cover-up, including the current director, John Brennan. In stark language, Udall accused the CIA of lying.
The CIA has lied to its overseers and the public, destroyed and tried to hold back evidence, spied on the Senate, made false charges against our staff, and lied about torture and the results of torture. And no one has been held to account. They are, right now, people serving in high-level positions at the agency who approved, directed, or committed acts related to the CIA's detention and interrogation program. It's bad enough not to prosecute these officials, but to reward or promote them and risk the integrity of the U.S. government to protect them is incomprehensible. The President needs to purge his administration of high-level officials who are instrumental to the development and running of this program.
That's outgoing Democratic Senator Mark Udall. Do you think John Brennan should be fired? Do you think George Bush, Dick Cheney, George Tenet, and others should be put on trial?
Well, I'll start just with the CIA and the senior leadership of the CIA. About 100 years ago, famous German sociologist Max Weber wrote a thesis in which he said that national security bureaucracies will use secrecy to cover up their mistakes and errors, and as a result, incompetent people will invariably rise to the top. And this is a reason why the use of secrecy has to be checked very carefully. And I think Udall's correct, because we see this very, very clearly in what's happened within our CIA over the course of the last 10 years. People who were involved in this torture and black sites program rose absolutely to the top of the agency, and they're still there, and that's shocking. I think had the public known, or had even most of the senior leadership in Washington known what they did and their mistakes, they never could have achieved these positions. So I think it's obviously the case that there should be a review of the senior echelons of the agency to remove those who made serious errors and who broke the law. And I think there's a very, very serious question about John Brennan. He may or may not have been involved in the program. He certainly tells us he wasn't. But he has misled the president and the Congress about what's going on. And in responding to the Senate committee report, he strode to a podium at the CIA and shoveled an amazing load of falsehoods. I mean, obviously untruthful statements in response. That's just shocking conduct that really should not be tolerated. And as for Dick Cheney and George Bush, I really don't think I can add anything to what Colonel Wilkerson and Richard Clark have said. I mean, I think you look at the report, it provides very persuasive evidence that torture was used to produce false evidence to justify the invasion of Iraq. That's buried in footnotes in the report, but it's there. It's very, very clear. And that's a shocking, it's a humiliating fact for the United States, and it's a fact that should have consequences.
Over the weekend, 9 Pakistanis were killed, as far as we know, in yet another drone strike, perhaps the first of 2015, though we don't absolutely know this. Talk about drones and the art of stealth warfare.
Well, I think that the use of drones it's very significant. It points to the way we've redirected our entire attitude towards waging war today. We prefer covert war we give the CIA a greater and greater role in waging this war. The CIA has become the opposite of what it was established to be in 1947, which is an intelligence analysis shop. Now it's focused very heavily on operations, and many of them sustained, like this drone war, which is a 10-year war. Now, the CIA gets to exercise that control by saying everything is secret. It's covert. It can't be discussed publicly. And as a result of saying that, the American people actually know much less about what's going on in Pakistan and about the strikes and the consequence of the strikes than people in Pakistan know, or even people in Europe and other nations know. And that's because of the American media's hesitancy to report on it. So we have not had the sort of policy discussion that we really should be having in this country about whether the use of drones in Pakistan is effective or whether it makes sense in terms of U.S. foreign policy. And I think the case against drones is a very, very powerful case, certainly in the case of Pakistan. Because in the bottom line, what you've seen since the drone war began is a transition in public opinion in Pakistan where the entire political spectrum is united against the United States, really an unbelievable feat for the U.S. to have accomplished. So we've turned a major nuclear power against us. And whereas these terrorist groups were operating at the margins in tribal society with friction with many of the tribal leaders, we've allowed them to consolidate their relationship with the tribals by striking these areas and killing a large number and wounding a large number of people who are innocent and are not connected to the terrorists. So it's caused a bonding. So that's all unforeseen consequences, but foreseeable consequences. And the public debate probably would lead to a decision to discontinue this operation.
You write about the path to quasi-war, Libya and Syria. What's happening today?
Well, I think the most disturbing thing overall is the way the country now processes a case for a new war. And I discuss at some length what happened with respect to Libya in 2011 and what's happened repeatedly now with respect to Syria. Historically, the administration would make a case for war. The president would go on television with an Oval Office address and explain why he thinks operations are correct. Congress would have debates and would vote support or vote its opposition to the war effort. And what we have now is a president, a White House that wants to avoid this sort of framing. We do not get these sort of Oval Office speeches from President Obama anymore. And a Congress that uses this as a political game. So people want to score partisan points off of it one way or the other. But Congress does not engage in its important deliberative function. So the democratic process of decision-making about war and peace has simply been short-circuited.
Speaking to NBC's Meet the Press last month after the Senate torture report was released, former Vice President Dick Cheney said he would do it all again.
With respect to trying to define that as torture, I come back to the proposition torture was what the al-Qaeda terrorists did to 3,000 Americans on 9/11. There's no comparison between that and what we did with respect to enhanced interrogation. It worked. It worked now for 13 years. We've avoided another mass casualty attack against the United States. We did capture bin Laden. We did capture an awful lot of the senior guys of al-Qaeda who were responsible for that attack on 9/11. I'd do it again in a minute.
I'd do it again in a minute, Vice President Cheney said.
Well, I think, that interview in my mind was really striking for the ineffectiveness with which questioning was conducted. You saw no follow-up from Chuck Todd to these statements, even though it's the same statements that Cheney's made over and over again, in which he assumes that torture techniques are effective when, in fact, all the evidence shows exactly the opposite, and in which he acts with an attitude that is expressed by the legal term depravity. So depravity in law means total indifference to serious harm that occurs to innocent people as a result of your conduct. And of course, he was asked specifically by Todd about the case of Gul Rahman, the person who was picked up as a result of mistaken identity, a completely innocent person, and who was tortured to death in Afghanistan in CIA custody. And what was the response of Cheney? He'd do it again in a minute. And all this is justified by 9/11. Of course, that's utter nonsense. It's also morally reprehensible nonsense. And the fact that that Vice President Cheney, former Director Hayden, Jose Rodriguez, and similar people command so much of the airtime in the United States to discuss this issue, in my mind, is amazing. They command it. They've had the lion's share for many, many months now, and we see ineffective questioning, and we don't see their statements being balanced by critics in any effective way.
Are CIA agents, officials afraid to go abroad now?
I think those, and I've recently interviewed 2 CIA agents who were involved in the program who tell me that they have been advised by the CIA's legal counsel office that they should not leave the country. So I think there's obvious, serious legal risk for anyone who was involved in this program and traveling abroad, but particularly those who were involved in running the black site stations in Poland, for instance, which is under criminal investigation right now, who were involved in the El Masri operation.
Scott, you have been looking at these issues in deep detail for years. What surprised you in the torture report?
I wouldn't say anything particularly surprised me. In fact, it was confirmation of what we'd seen before. In fact, confirmation that actually the situation was worse than we had ever suspected before, consistently. But if anything surprised me a bit, it was the role of the media, because one thing the Senate committee did an excellent job of was research the way the CIA had interacted with and manipulated the media, including some very prominent journalists. Doug Gell, for instance, a well-known national security writer from the New York Times, now editor at the Washington Post, comes up repeatedly in the report, as do many others. And what we saw was a repeated pattern in which the CIA fed them false information in the form of leaks. And I think this is a huge problem with national security reporting in the United States generally, this idea of pseudo-links that are put out by the CIA. While the CIA is telling the courts don't release the actual files for national security reasons, it puts out adulterated or falsified versions to ostensibly credible reporters.
What needs to be done?
I think what needs to be done is a lot more information needs to be in the public sector. So right now we're just drowning in the sea of secrets. There's a need for much more information in real time to be available so that people can be well informed and can have a good, meaningful, consequential discussion of these many issues.
Well, thank you for helping to inform us with your new book, Lords of Secrecy, the National Security Elite and America's Stealth Foreign Policy. Scott Horton, human rights attorney, contributing editor at Harper's Magazine. That does it for our broadcast. Congratulations to Carlo and Lisa de Jesus on the birth of Ronan Antonio de Jesus, and a very happy birthday to Clara Ibarra. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burker, Nate Feltzer, Armando Nermin Sheikh, Steve Martinez, Sam Alkoff, Hani Massoud, Ravi Karen, Dina Guzder, Amy Littlefield, Anna Osbeck, and Sam Riddell, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby. I'm Amy Goodman. Our website's democracynow.org.